Hello, welcome to this last lecture on external validity, where we'll be talking about a form of validity that has been the source of increasing interest, especially among policy audiences. So external validity refers to the extent to which a causal relationship, which again from our previous module was about internal validity. In this case, it refers to whether a causal relationship holds over variations in persons, settings, treatments, and outcomes, which is a phrase that is derived from Tom Cook and his colleagues in 2002. And in particular, one of the main questions that has to do with external validity or generalizability is whether the impacts of, let's say, an interactive tutoring program implemented among students in schools in urban settings have the same impacts for students in schools in rural settings. Questions of external validity can refer to both individuals and units in and not in the study. So when you're talking about whether the results from a study would apply to a population, for example, that is also a question about external validity or generalizability. In practice, there are several frameworks for external validity, and the first and the most common is actually known as the narrow to broad framework, in which under this framework, the focus is on whether the causal relationship based on individuals in a study would apply to individuals in a larger population of inference. So for example, if we were to conduct a study on a sample of schools in Philadelphia, and generalize it to the sample of schools in the entire district or possibly to other schools in the Philadelphia area, this would fall under the narrow to broad setting. In external validity studies, when the sample is a subset of the inference population, this is referred to as generalizability. But in cases when the sample is not necessarily a subset of the target population, but we're still interested in knowing the extent to which the results apply, then this is known as transportability. The other type of framework, which is you can think of as the opposite of the narrow to broad, is known as the broad to narrow, in which here the focus is about the results from an experimental study sample to a smaller group or to an individual. And then finally, the third framework for external validity is known as generalizing or thinking about units at a similar level. And this type of generalization refers to the extent to which a relationship holds from one experimental sample to another sample at similar levels of aggregation. So if we were to conduct a study in a single school, for example, then an example of a similar level of generalization would be to apply the results to students in a different school, but still at the school level. And not surprisingly, because there are many possible threats to different sources of validity in general, we also have to be mindful of threats to external validity. The first and the most common is actually an analog to the absence of randomization for internal validity, and this has to do with the absence of randomization due to sample selection. The second is an interaction between the causal relationship and treatment variations. The third is the interaction between the causal relationship and the outcome type. And then we have interaction between the causal relationship and the study setting, as well as context-dependent mediation. So let's start with non-random sample selection, which is the most common threat to external validity. And here, when we have individuals who voluntarily participate in a study compared to those who choose not to, differences in backgrounds, experiences, and motivations may affect the individual's responses to an intervention or treatment. So for example, students who are willing to participate in an interactive tutoring system may be those who do not necessarily need the tutoring system, and the effects of the program on these students may be different, and in particular may not generalize to students who need the additional tutoring for their course grades. In education, non-random sample selection is very common. And in fact, in a study by Rob Olson and colleagues in 2013, they found that less than 3% of the studies that were listed in a digest used random sampling in their study design. Another threat to external validity refers to the interaction between the causal relationship and possible variations of the treatment. So when the magnitude and/or direction of the causal relationship varies or changes over different treatment variations and combinations, then this presents a threat to external validity. So in the same study about the interactive virtual tutoring system, suppose that some schools that choose to implement the system have great administrative and family support, while others do not. And if the impact of the tutoring system was larger because of the support from administrators, families, and communities, then this dependence presents a challenge for the externality of the impacts, since the contextual factors, namely here support from administrators, families, and communities, might not be the same across different types of schools and institutions. Another type of validity threat that is due to interaction is one between the causal relationship and the outcomes. This particular threat concerns the extent to which the causal relationship differs depending on what outcome is used to measure the impact. So if the tutoring system was effective in improving test scores by a certain number of points, but it has little to no effect on mitigating student boredom with the subject, then research audiences may question the generalizability of the system's impact if it can only target, let's say, academic outcomes based on the number of points, and not other types of outcomes such as mitigating negative affective states. Here, it is helpful to consider the intervention or treatment's full impact on all types of outcomes or dependent variables during the design stage of the study, so that this will allow researchers to identify which outcomes of the study it's meant to target and whether it's feasible based on the outcomes of policy interests. Next, we have to consider interaction of causal relationship with study settings, where the main question is whether the causal relationship between the treatment and the dependent variable holds across all types of study settings. So, for example, if the tutoring system is accessible to students during school, would that be just as effective as when students access the system at home? Or do the impacts vary depending on whether the app is still available in urban school settings versus rural school settings? So whenever there's a dependence between the nature of the causal relationship and the particular setting or context in which the relationship is being studied, then these interactions or variations in the relationship collectively constitute a threat to external validity. Then finally, we have context-dependent mediation, where when changes in the study context affects the causal relationship, this dependence also presents a challenge to external validity. So in the same example on the tutoring system, suppose that it was implemented among a sample of schools and the system is shown to be beneficial to students through direct tutoring and indirectly through increased opportunities for teachers to attend professional development workshops. However, if the system's effect on teachers is different among urban schools, where there's a larger number of teachers, for example, compared to rural schools, this mediating effect of teachers on student performance may affect the generalizability of the tutoring system's impact. So in this particular example, because of the larger teacher-to-student ratio among students in urban schools, and because of the potential mediating effect that teacher opportunities to attend professional development workshops may have, then differences in the teacher-student ratio here between urban and rural schools constitute a mediating effect, and more importantly, a threat to external validity and the generalizability of the results. Now, similar to the quasi-experimental approaches to mitigate the threats to internal validity in non-experimental settings, we also have methods to improve external validity in the absence of random sampling, which again is the most common threat to external validity and generalizability. So, while random sampling is the strongest tool to ensure the external validity of a study's results, it is actually very rare in education and other disciplines, and it's much more common for researchers to engage in purposeful or intentional sampling in which certain student populations are specifically targeted and invited to be recruited into a study. However, quasi-experimental methods based on improving internal validity in observational studies can easily be extended to improve the external validity in non-randomly selected samples. While multiple frameworks for generalization exist, the one that has been the focus in education research for over a decade is the narrow to broad perspective, namely generalizing from experimental studies to target populations of inference. So how do we extend the results or the methods from the internal validity threats to the case when we're trying to improve and overcome the threats to external validity? Well, let's start with the first example, which was based on matching. So like matching in observational and quasi-experimental studies, it can also be used to reduce bias due to systematic differences in external validity studies. But the main difference is that instead of comparing a treatment and control group from an observational study, for the purpose of generalization and external validity, we are now comparing individuals in usually a non-randomly selected study sample and those in a target population of inference. So the perspective in this case is different, where in internal validity examples, we were talking about a treatment and control group. Here for external validity, we're talking about a sample and a population. And importantly, to achieve the most bias reduction, the variables that we use to match should be the ones that moderate the treatment impact, but in this case also predict sample selection. So whenever we are trying to use matching to reduce bias and improve the external validity in these types of studies, the variables or characteristics or features that we're using should help us predict who will be in the sample and who will not be, and also help us to predict changes in the dependent variable or the treatment impact. Propensity scores, as they've played an important role in observational studies, have also played an incredibly important role in generalizability studies as well. In both cases, they continue to be one of the most commonly used methods to improve, in this case, generalizations, particularly from non-randomly selected samples. For generalization studies, propensity scores model the probability of belonging to the study or participating in the study versus population, and they share the same properties as propensity scores in observational studies. Namely, they are also balancing scores so that matching by them is equivalent to matching by all the variables used to estimate the propensity scores. And like the case when we are talking about observational studies, we can also estimate the propensity scores in generalizability studies using logistic regression. And lastly, as an extension to the weighting approaches used in internal validity studies, we can also use propensity scores in weighting approaches where a weight is assigned to individuals or units in the sample, and a separate weight is assigned to individuals or units in the inference population. Here, the weights are actually used to make the sample look like the population, with the understanding that when the sample is compositionally similar to the population, this will limit the threats to external validity due to non-random selection into the sample.